Hi, I'm Tanya Martin. I work for Mennonite Mission Network as a worker care coordinator.
And hi, I'm Katya Norton, and I have done Youth Venture in Switzerland and France.
We're so glad you have committed to serving through the Youth Venture program, whether as a leader or as a participant. As you prepare for your assignment, we'd like to offer some thoughts on healthy boundaries to help your experience be the best it can be. Today we'll talk about harassment and how to have healthy boundaries with both adults and with children. These topics can be challenging ones, but they are so important.
Mennonite Mission Network highly values community, and we hope our Youth Venture teams work to foster safe and healthy communities as they work and serve alongside our partners around the world. We hope that none of you will either cause or receive harassment or abuse of any kind while serving through Youth Venture. But if it does happen, we hope that you will be able to recognize it and know what to do.
As we begin this conversation, we realize that it is possible, even likely, that some of you have already experienced harassment or abuse of some form in your lives already. If so, this discussion could be uncomfortable or even painful. If you feel at any time during this video that memories or hurt are too strong, please stop the video and take care of yourself. And then, when you are ready, we encourage you to find a safe person to talk with about your experiences or unhealed hurt to begin the journey toward healing. Our hope for this discussion is not to increase your hurt in any way, but to increase our awareness and understanding and work toward prevention of harassment and abuse. So let's start by talking about boundaries.
Boundaries can feel restrictive to us at times. Our natural tendency is to want to cross them or at least push them a bit. But at times, boundaries can help us feel safe as well.
Some boundaries are just simply a necessity. Boundaries that are built and maintained well can allow us to live together safely. They show us where our responsibility ends and another's begins. In this case, they keep the neighbor's livestock where they're supposed to be, at least most of the time. They allow neighbors to live together peacefully.
And boundaries in relationships do the same thing. They honor and respect the space of another and create the possibility for a relationship. Like this barbed wire fence, they need to be crossed with care, and they occasionally need to be tended and repaired. But in that process, trust grows relationships.
So what are the goals of healthy boundaries in a service setting? I think the first goal is to create space for relationships with those who you will serve and those you will serve alongside. The goal is to protect those who are vulnerable, like the clients, the children, the elderly people, or the people with disabilities, even other volunteers, and you. I think it's helpful to think about boundaries in terms of boundary crossings and boundary violations.
Boundary crossings are a part of life, ministry, and service. Anytime we touch someone, we cross a boundary. A physical boundary. Anytime we ask someone a personal question, we cross a social or emotional boundary. These crossings are neutral in and of themselves. Boundary crossing is a necessity in relationships. It's how we build relationships and will likely be a natural part of your service assignment.
Boundary violations, on the other hand, occur when the boundary crossing is not in the best interest of the other and results in harm. So, commenting on someone's appearance in a way that makes them uncomfortable would be one example. The key to knowing the difference is to consider for what purpose and in whose interest are we crossing the boundary? Who is benefiting from the action, you or the receiver? The same activity could be either a crossing or a violation. For example, a phone call can be used either to build the other person up or to harm them.
Jesus was all about boundary crossings, eating with sinners, talking with women, touching lepers, and healing on the Sabbath. But he never crossed boundaries to cause the other person harm or for his own gratification. He never violated boundaries.
So let's take a few moments here to consider these concepts in the context of your youth venture experience. What are the boundary crossings you will likely encounter? And what are the possible boundary violations that could occur? Perhaps even unintentionally if you aren't paying attention.
You'll likely be meeting lots of new people during your youth venture experience. One example of boundary crossing might be hugging a person you don't know very well. If the other person initiated the contact, your hug could be an appropriate boundary crossing, one that conveys care and makes the person feel accepted and valued.
But if you initiate the hug and it makes the other person feel uncomfortable, then it has become a boundary violation, even if you didn't mean for it to be. So take a few moments now to pause the video and consider what possible boundary crossings you might encounter in your youth venture experience and the potential boundary violations. Remember, when our needs take priority and we forget the importance of acting in the best interest of others, we are at increased risk of boundary violations. Let's take a little time to consider harassment, what it is, and what we can do about it. We'll start by defining sexual harassment. The law defines sexual harassment as unwelcome sexual advances, request for sexual favors, or other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature. So that could include things like name-calling, comments about a person's body or sexual activity, physical gestures, stereotyping based on a person's gender, or offensive jokes spoken or sent electronically.
The Civil Rights Act of 1964 protects people against workplace harassment in the U.S., and state laws address harassment outside of the workplace, like on the street or the bus or other public places. The cultural norms may be different than what you are used to in a place where you are going to serve. Recognizing those differences can be helpful as you respond to harassment.
But always remember, harassment is not okay, and it's not the receiver's fault. Mennonite Mission Network's harassment prevention policy states, Mennonite Mission Network strives to provide a work environment where relationships are empowered by respect, where power is not abused, and where no one will be subjected to harassment and/or bullying. Our staff, workers, and participants go through regular harassment and discrimination prevention training. Mennonite Mission Network will not tolerate workplace bullying or harassment of any kind, or the use of racial, sexual, gender-biased, age-related, ethnic, or disability-related innuendos, slurs, or jokes. So harassment can come in many forms. It can be based on any of these things and more. Mennonite Mission Network asks all staff, workers, and program participants to be aware of situations where intervention is warranted, especially when others condone, overlook, or actively ignore the offending situation. If you experience harassment, intimidation, bullying, or abuse, or if you observe another person being harassed, bullied, or abused, it is very important to report this conduct. To report harassment or abuse of any kind, please contact your youth venture leader or a youth venture staff person. So what can we do if we observe or experience harassment of some kind? Here are 5 possible responses to situations of harassment or abuse, things that you can do to support your neighbor in the moment.
Distract. Interrupt the situation.
Ignore the harasser and calmly engage the person who is being targeted. For example, strike up a conversation with the person being harassed. Ask them for the time or for directions. Or you can delegate. Ask others to help out. In a school, you might ask a teacher or a counselor. On the street, maybe talk with another bystander and decide what should be done. In a business, ask the business owner to intervene. Or on the bus, let the bus driver know that harassment is happening. But before calling the police, always ask the targeted person.
Delay. If you can't act right away, check with the targeted person at a later time. For example, ask, "Are you okay? I saw what happened and it wasn't okay. What do you need?" Just acknowledging the harassment and checking in with them can help to reduce the feelings of isolation, fear, and can lessen the trauma. Studies show this may be the most effective intervention for the victim.
Or you can document the situation. Film the abuse if you have your cell phone, or write down what you observed. But ask the targeted person before sharing any of that footage. And finally, the last option is to directly intervene in the situation. This is by far the most risky option. First, assess the situation and decide if this approach is safe for you and the receiver. Consider the risks and read the nonverbals in the situation. If it's safe, confront the situation. Be firm, clear, and concise. For example, "That's not appropriate. Leave them alone." Or, "I see what you are doing. It's harassment and it's not okay."
Let's take a few minutes here to reflect together. Pause the video for a few minutes and talk through these questions as a team. How is harassment handled in the cultural context of your service location?
What types of harassment are common there?
What are places that might put you in greater risk to experience harassment?
And what responses that we've talked about may work well or not so well in that cultural context?
And lastly, what things can you do to limit your risk of being harassed?
So let's take some time now to talk about child safety. How can you work to keep the children you may encounter in your service assignment safe? Here's Mennonite Mission Network's statement on child safety. Mennonite Mission Network also strives for the well-being of children that we live and work with. Every child deserves to be understood and valued, to be healthy, safe, and nurtured. Our staff, workers, and participants are trained in how to create a safe environment for children, youth, and vulnerable adults. Mennonite Mission Network does not tolerate any abuse of children and actively works to prevent child abuse in all its forms. So we'd like to take some time today to think about healthy boundaries with children and giving you some tools to set appropriate boundaries in your own relationships with children and some tips on what you can be watching for in your own communities and where you'll be serving.
Many of us choose to be active participants in churches, faith communities, and faith-based organizations because we believe they are valuable and helpful in bringing healing and hope, right? It may be part of why you are choosing to serve through a Christian mission organization. Churches and faith-based organizations can help. They provide spiritual guidance, concrete services or basic needs such as helping people with food, shelter, and clothing.
They provide social support by connecting people to a community of emotional and physical support. They can also provide leadership training opportunities. And they nurture and listen to children and youth. Research shows that the number one thing that teens want from their church is for adults to take them seriously and listen to them. But I also think it's helpful for us to name why our churches and faith-based organizations are vulnerable. Because sometimes they are in denial that abuse exists. We might say, "Oh no, not here. That's not something that our community would ever have to deal with." Or, "We're just a big happy family here. We all know each other, and we would know if something bad would happen." And sometimes churches trust too much. When we need a volunteer to do something, we are happy to have someone to do it. We often trust their intentions without question. Or we doubt that someone we know could do anything bad, and we explain away their behaviors. That was strange, but I'm sure they didn't mean anything by that. Or maybe I just misunderstood what I saw. Sometimes churches and faith-based organizations often expect the best in everyone. But high-trust situations create high risk. It's those times when we don't even consider the possibility of harm that we are at greater risk. And sometimes churches think they can take care of allegations themselves. They may be afraid of the news getting out to the broader community, or they want to protect a high-profile member, so they keep situations of abuse or harm a secret, which puts others at risks. As people of faith, we value forgiveness. It's an important part of our own faith experience. But sometimes that leads us to expect forgiveness too soon, which can further harm victims. It can diminish the harm that has been done and not adequately prevent future occurrences. And lastly, sometimes churches don't have or don't implement protection policies.
As we talked about earlier, we need boundaries. Boundaries protect you against false allegations, empower you to observe and report inappropriate behavior, and help us fulfill our mandate as Christians to protect children.
Jesus strongly advocates for children in this passage from Matthew. So Jesus called a child to come and stand in front of them and said, "Whoever welcomes in my name a child such as this welcomes me. If anyone should cause one of these little ones to lose faith in me, it would be better for that person to have a large millstone tied around their neck and be drowned in the deep sea. How terrible for the world that there are things that make people lose their faith. Such things will always happen, but how terrible for the one who causes them." Such strong words of caution. How great is our responsibility. Let's take a look here at the 4 types of child abuse: physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, and neglect. I think it's important to note that neglect is the most common form of abuse across broader society, but sexual abuse is the most common form of abuse in church settings. It is also the most underreported, as it is the hardest for a child to disclose. So what can we be watching for? Many recently have been talking about grooming, and I think it can put folks on edge at times and make us feel almost afraid to get too close to children. But grooming is more than just being friendly with a child. It's not about that, but it's about isolating a child with the intention of taking advantage of them. So you might see it as someone who's especially preoccupied with one child or a couple of children from one family. They insist on being physical with a child. You might see it as one who continually tries to arrange time alone with a child, or one who makes inappropriate comments about a youth's looks or bodies. Or you may see it as one who encourages a child to lie to their parents or to keep a secret.
These are things you should be aware of and can be watching for, but not intended to make you suspicious or hesitant to invest in lives of children.
Something that Faith Trust Institute talks about that I think is helpful is the difference between wanderers versus predators in relationships with children and other adults. It's helpful to remember that we all have the potential to wander across boundaries, whether we're not paying attention to power imbalances or just letting something get out of hand. When a person lacks awareness and good judgment, sometimes they wander across boundaries. So participating in training, becoming aware of the risks, can help wanderers remember to look for the boundaries they need. Predators, on the other hand, will cross boundaries intentionally and skillfully. They lack conscience and have limited self-awareness and seek to control others. Prevention and setting boundaries is not going to keep them from crossing boundaries. I think it's good for us to keep the difference between those in mind.
So what can we do? One thing we can do is model healthy boundaries in your own relationships with children and with other vulnerable adults. And what are some ways that we can do that?
Giving children and other adults choice about touch can empower them and also help limit our risk of our touch being confusing or being a boundary violation. So ask a person before you hug them, especially a child. Or you could give them a choice. Hey, hug or high five today. That ability to have a choice can be really empowering for children. And make sure that your touch is only done in a public place, so not behind closed doors. Remember that those who lack boundaries often need help learning to set boundaries. So that child that may be crawling up into your lap may lack good boundaries, and that makes them more vulnerable to being taken advantage of by someone else. So just helping them learn boundaries can be really important. So you might gently say, I'm sorry, you can't sit on my lap right now, but you could sit right here beside me. Or to a youth, you might say, I'd be happy to talk with you. Let's meet at the coffee shop. Or you can lean down to speak with a child at eye level. That's an easy way to let a child know you're listening to them and you care about what they're saying without even touching them. Or a pat on the hand, shoulder, or back is another simple affirmation. A pat feels very different than a hand that lingers there longer.
So what should you do if you see something that is concerning or hear a child talk about something that concerns you?
Well, first, you want to believe the child, because we know that false reports are incredibly rare. If a child shares about abuse that has happened to them and they're not taken seriously, they may not ever be willing to risk sharing again. You also want to make sure that the child or the vulnerable adult is and feels safe. You also want to remember that it's not up to you to investigate the situation yourself, especially in a case where a minor is involved. We always let the local authorities handle investigating accusations. If the organization where you are serving has a response plan, follow it. And if you're not sure if there's a plan, ask. Report your concerns to your youth venture leader or to a youth venture staff person.
Let's take a few minutes here to pause the video and discuss these questions with your team. Do you know what child safety laws are in the place of your service location? If not, who can you ask? What are cultural norms in your service location regarding child discipline and/or abuse? Who can you talk to if you have a concern about child safety, or if you see or hear something that you aren't sure whether to be concerned about?
Thanks for watching and participating in this conversation today. We are grateful that you are offering your time to learn and serve together with your team. We look forward to hearing about your experience.